Well, good evening. I think I've solved all the problems. The first problem, while I'm a little bit late starting, is a technical problem in that I had a 2-year-old who needed to go to bed. The second problem was also technical in that I started the YouTube stream going, but forgot to change the listing from private to public, which is quite an error if you're trying to stream something, as it wouldn't do me much good if I was the only person who could watch it. So hopefully now the stream is online and people can join it. And if you want to watch it later, then obviously you are watching it later. So this is a video that can stay up certainly for Advent, so people can catch up if they do miss a week. And we'll keep doing it in this fashion, as I think that will work best for us this Advent. Now, obviously the next 4 weeks we're going to be reading John's Gospel together, and that really is the idea. That's what I want, is to be able to think each day that people across our parish are reading the same text. And it is something that even though we're in our own houses, even though we are sort of safe, we can still have that sense of we're doing this together. And part of what I hope these talks will help is to give that sense of bringing some of those thoughts and reflections together. So if at any point during the week there's a question, or if you just have a thought that you want to share, then do send me an email or give me a call, because I think that's a lovely thing to be able to sort of really engage with the text as we go through it. I think part of reading a chapter a day is a really good practice, because it's a short sort of a short bit of reading, which gives us a chance to reflect quite deeply on it. So rather than reading the whole thing in a day, where you'd end up skipping over bits and not noticing certain bits, if you read a chapter a day, you can really get some depth on it. You can really focus for that 10 minutes that it's going to take you to read it. But also, it should give us that real sense of the whole narrative arc of the whole gospel, because so often we just hear bits here and there, and we might hear the whole of the Passion in Holy Week, but we don't actually sit down and get that whole sense of the gospel. And that's really important in all the gospels, but actually in St. John's Gospel it's most important, because St. John's Gospel really, of all the gospels, is the most complete in the sense that it is kind of a work of literature, in that it's not just, we'll slot this section in here and we'll put this miracle in here. It's very much written with an arc from start to finish. And I think that will become clear as we're reading it, and hopefully through these talks. Now, I wanted to start tonight by sharing something of my own experience of John's Gospel. For me, it's such an important text. In fact, I started reading this Gospel at A-level and studying at A-level, and in the end, it was the reason I ended up studying theology. I so fell in love with the language and the symbolism. It really spoke to me, and not especially from a religious or a spiritual point of view at all. I just thought it was a perfect way of expressing a theology and a philosophy. So in fact then, of course, studying theology was the vehicle by which I both came to faith and took on this calling. So actually, if I hadn't loved John's Gospel, and if I hadn't studied it at the age of 17, I would now be living a very different life. Now, one of the things is there's an element of mystery about this gospel. Who wrote it? When did they write it? Is it the same writers as the Johannine epistles, which are later in the New Testament, or the book of Revelation, which is, of course, John of Patmos? Is it more or less historical than the other gospels? And how and why is it different? And then there is the question of who is the mysterious beloved disciple referred to in this gospel, but no others, and no name given. There is all these sort of background questions. But for me, it was the symbolism and the structure of it that first arrested me. It's not just one thing after another, not a gathering of sayings of Jesus. It's organized with a purpose. It has themes, and it can be read as a story, but the discerning reader will find more beneath the surface. The words have depth, they have a certain power. So in these 4 talks, I'm not going to be interesting. I'm not going to address the academic questions like those I mentioned. I'm taking the gospel very much on its own terms. I want people to read a chapter a day to get the full sense of it in these 3 weeks. And in these talks, I'll try and convey what is the purpose of the gospel, why is it written, and what does it ask of you? What does it tell us about God, about Jesus, and what it means to follow him? The vision presented by John is often quite stark. Are you on Team Jesus or on Team World? John is in the business of recruitment, but he wants to surprise you, to challenge you. And he goes further than any of the other Gospels in what he says about Jesus and about God and about the Christian life. So in these talks, I want to uncover this, and I want you to understand the life-changing revelation that John gives us, the way he turns Jewish theology upside down, but presents a clear and coherent new theology. This is definitely the boldest gospel. It's the most intelligent and the most intellectual gospel. It seems a funny thing to say, but it's also the most well-written gospel. Now, my hope is that in tracing some of the larger themes, when throughout the year we come to those sections of the gospel, we'll have a fuller picture to relate them to. I also hope that in understanding more of the depths of our faith, we will develop our own theology and understand more about the ways of God in this world. And finally, I personally find the vision of John's gospel the most reassuring, the clearest in identifying the difficulties of this life, the most straightforward in discussing God and the meaning of life. And I hope that as we move through this Advent, we'll have a chance to discuss the relevance of this gospel for today. So I want to start today by looking at the purpose and the structure of the gospel. So why is John's gospel written? It's not biography, it's not history, it's not written by someone with an interest. Those genres didn't even exist in that day. But we're in luck here because John actually tells us why he wrote it. This gospel is written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. And there's 2 aspects to this then. Firstly, that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. That is to say that he is the awaited king, the one who is to restore Israel, and as Son of God, one who has a unity of purpose with God, through whom God acts. And actually, John wants to take you one step further. He wants you to come to believe that Jesus is God, as Thomas declares on seeing the resurrected Christ, my Lord and my God. Or equally, as we know from the beginning of the gospel, Jesus is the Word made flesh, who was in the beginning, who is God. The second aspect is that in believing you may have life in his name. We'll come back to this, as life is a key term for John and a concept that will set him apart from the other Gospels. So the aim of the Gospel for John is to communicate who Jesus is. And this is apparent throughout. In other Gospels, Jesus is baptized. In John, this isn't required. Jesus is already the person that he intends to be. He will pass through death in another way. In the other Gospels, Jesus and the authorities clash over interpretations of the law, over the Sabbath, his liberalism, his associates. In John, the conflict is always over who Jesus says that he is. In the other Gospels, Jesus is tempted by Satan. He faces the agony in Gethsemane. In the Passion, he loses control and is put to death. In John, there is no temptation. There is no agony. Jesus knows exactly what he is about. And yes, he is put to death, but he's spoken freely about this from the start. On the cross, he entrusts his mother to his friend. There is no, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? He remains in control in obedience to the Father. Jesus, from start to finish, knows who he is. The question in the gospel is always, who do you say that I am? So who does John say that Jesus is? Well, John's gospel famously begins, in the beginning was the Word. And we're told, aptly, usually at Christmas, that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. That is to say, the Word is Jesus. The Greek here is logos, meaning word or reason, speaking, speech, account, subject. It's a versatile word. It's used by Greek philosophy, the Stoics and the Neoplatonists as right reason, or as the mediating divine presence in creation. But there's also a close parallel to the Jewish concept of wisdom. So Proverbs 8 reads, "The Lord created me at the beginning of his work, the first of his acts of long ago. Ages ago I was set up, at the first, before the beginning of the earth. When he marked out the foundations of the earth, then I was beside him like a master worker, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing before him always, rejoicing in his inhabited world, and delighting in the human race. Whoever finds me finds life and obtains favor from the Lord." When you come to read John 1 tomorrow, the parallels with John's prologue are striking. But there's also a more direct connection with Hebrew theology. John deliberately parallels the beginning of Genesis. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. In the beginning, God creates with the words, "Let there be light." And moreover, the point of creation is to create life, which culminates in humanity. So what we find, even in these opening lines of the gospel, is an assertion about Jesus and a cluster of themes: reason and wisdom, light, life, creativity, and the divine. But of course, what they add up to, and what is explicitly stated in the prologue of John's Gospel, is that the Word, Jesus, is God. Now, this is a strange thing to say. We may not quite realize that we're so used to it. But it was no less strange to Jews than it is to us now, to connect eternity and the author of the universe with a finite creature is peculiar. But it's there in the prologue. And the disciple Thomas proclaims, "My Lord and my God," as he is confronted by the resurrected Jesus. And throughout the gospel, we have these hints and suggestions of who Jesus really is. Principally, these come in the form of what are called the great similitudes. So through the body of the gospel, Jesus declares that he is 7 things, and numbers are always significant for John. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the door of the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the true vine. I will look at these in more detail along with the signs or miracles next week. But the formulation itself is significant. The Greek reads, ego eimi, I am, an emphatic I am. The ego eimi formulation also occurs in a more hidden fashion earlier in the Gospel, meeting the Samaritan woman and walking on the water in chapters 4 and 6, and then later at the arrest at night. And it's no accident. The formulation corresponds with the meeting of Moses with God at the burning bush. In this climactic scene which begins the Exodus and the Mosaic covenant, God calls Moses to send him to say to Pharaoh, "Let my people go." Moses asks who he should say is sending him. That is to say, he asks for the name of God. The response is best translated, I am that I am, a name treated afterwards as so holy that it is not pronounced. Do not take the Lord's name in vain. Later, the same divine name is reinvoked by God throughout the prophecy of Isaiah. I am he who blots out your transgression. I am, and there is no one beside me. I am he, I am the first, and I am the last. I am he who comforts you, and so on. So when Jesus is describing himself, his mission in these great statements that we'll come back to, he is first of all saying, I am divine. And this is the real purpose of the gospel. This is revelation. Now, it's the nature of belief today that people tend to begin from the question, do you believe in God? Now, it's sort of a normal question. It wouldn't strike you necessarily as peculiar. But actually, it is a very odd question. And it's a very modern question. It presumes there's an abstract, agreed-upon definition of the word God. Now, philosophy has at times sought to argue for such a thing, but no one worships an abstraction, though people love to argue about abstractions. The fourth gospel does not say, do you believe in God? Yes, very good. Well, that God that you're thinking of, Jesus was that. Does not say that. The gospel does something altogether more interesting. It presents the person of Jesus Christ and then says, this person reveals God. This person, Jesus Christ, is God. And so equally, those who don't know Jesus don't know God. And this is where John's gospel is the sharpest, dividing between the world and the spirit. Nicodemus can't get beyond a literal sense of being born again. Some disciples walk away when Jesus says they must eat his flesh. When Jesus speaks of raising the temple in 3 days, the Jews don't understand that he means his body. Thomas won't believe the spiritual until he places his hands in the actual physical wounds. John's gospel asks us to move from seeing in worldly ways to spiritual ways. So what I would like you to do as we go through these next 3 weeks is to throw out your old idea of God. Throw out the old man, the heavenly spirit, the pervading life force. Throw out the 18th century rational God as all-knowing, all-powerful, all-present, all-good. And start with the question, who is the God that Jesus reveals? Who is Jesus Christ? It is the question at the heart of the gospel. It's revealed subtly and then directly. Who is Jesus Christ today? And will you join him? Now, to help us begin this task of reading the fourth gospel, I'm going to set out the structure briefly and some things to bear in mind as we start reading. I can't go through the gospel in great detail, though as I read each chapter, evening prayer during the week, I will say something about it. But hopefully this short breakdown will give us something of an overview. So I've already spoken about the famous prologue that begins the gospel. Within it contained most of the central themes of it. Following this, we have John the Baptist. He takes a very low-key role in the gospel, this gospel, his central job being just to point to Christ. After a shortened call of the disciples, we have the first scene in Galilee, the turning of water into wine. The miracles in John are called signs, not miracles. Rather than detail lots of descriptions of healings, John selects a few occasions which speak of who Jesus is. that give him room to teach. And while the miracles of the other Gospels show Jesus' humanity, his pity, his care, his love, John's signs show his divinity. They show who he is in himself. John then places the cleansing of the temple at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. In the other Gospels, it's at the end. It's the catalyst to the passion narrative. So it's significant that John places it early to signify Jesus' control over the timetable. He's not a rag doll. He knows when his hour is. In chapters 3 and 4, we have a trilogy where faith increases with the distance we move from the traditional teachers of Israel. So the Jewish leader leaves Jesus bewildered at night, signifying his spiritual darkness. The Samaritan woman at the well begins with a worldly misunderstanding, thinking that Jesus is offering her real water. She leaves, however, with the living water and leaves behind her water jar. The trilogy ends with the second sign, as the Gentile official finds his reward for his unquestioning faith. In the middle section of the Gospel, we move through miracles familiar to the other Gospels, but given a particular inflection by John and used as the launching point for engaging in a conflict with the Jewish authorities over who Jesus claims to be. So Jesus heals on the Sabbath, then feeds the 5,000 as the third and fourth signs, which provide the backdrop for a longer reflection on the division that Jesus is creating between the world and the spirit. This section is interrupted by the woman caught in adultery, which is in itself a fascinating episode, but a very different style and language to the rest of the gospel, so probably not John. By the fifth sign in chapter 9, the healing of the man born blind, the Jews are already looking for an opportunity to murder Jesus, and John is able to return to his favorite contrast of the worldly interpretations of the Jews against the spiritual truths of Jesus, here as the light of the world. The rejection of the Jewish leaders is explicit in Jesus proclaiming himself as the good shepherd. And as things come to a head, Jesus goes to Lazarus for his sixth most climactic sign in raising Lazarus from the dead. In the same chapter, ironically, on hearing of Jesus' power over life and death, the Jews plot to murder him. Now at this point, the gospel shifts in key as we move through the anointing of Bethany and Palm Sunday. And from chapter 13, we gain access to the upper room and the final teachings of Jesus. There's no Last Supper in this gospel. The sacraments are conspicuously absent, possibly to protect the secrecy of a persecuted church. We do, though, have the washing of the disciples' feet, which serves as a metaphor for baptism and the backdrop for Jesus' teaching on humility, service, and love. Throughout these farewell discourses, Jesus draws a strong opposition between the church and the world, with the acceptance or rejection of him as the touching point. He looks ahead to the persecution of the church, but promises the Spirit will come to comfort and to guide them. We then move to the arrest and passion, and there is a great calm about Jesus throughout. The trials are set against Peter's denial, demonstrating on two fronts the weakness of humanity. Jesus is then mocked as king, which is set ironically against Pilate in his earthly kingship. Pilate is shown as weak, unjust, manipulated by the people, and issuing the feeble, cynical question, what is truth? Jesus is then crucified, conspicuously fulfilling Scripture before he bows his head and gives up his spirit. This is the spirit that will return to empower the disciples. And as his side is pierced, outpour blood and water, again a discrete reference to the sacraments and the birth of the church. The seventh sign, the resurrection, is discovered first by Mary Magdalene, but confirmed by two men, the required witnesses for a law court of the time. The beloved disciple, who it seems is the hero for the community for whom John is writing, arrives first and sees and believes, a theme that begins in the first chapter of the Gospel. But he, of course, sees only an empty tomb, reinforcing the faith of those in the generation of John's writing who did not meet the historical Jesus. We then have the resurrection appearances, emotively with Mary, then in the upper room, and finally with Thomas. In the epilogue, we have a final resurrection appearance with the miracle of breakfast fish. And this concludes with the rehabilitation of Peter. So essentially, the first half of the Gospel is a book of signs revealing who Jesus is. The second half of the Gospel records the final teaching of Jesus, and then the Passion. The hour and climax to which the Gospel moves is the crucifixion. And we might well question whether it's actually the crucifixion rather than the resurrection that should be seen as the final seventh sign. But more on that later. So in this first week of Advent, we move through the preliminaries of Jesus' ministry, praying that our eyes would be opened in reading this gospel to behold the light of the world, and that in meeting Christ, we would be transformed into his image. Amen. So hopefully next week you'll be able to join me, some of you, in person, which would be wonderful. It's much nicer talking to people rather than an empty room. So do put that in your diaries. And we will, of course, continue to stream the videos on YouTube. Do get in touch if you have any thoughts or questions, and do try and get through those chapters. To be honest, you could read all 7 chapters on a Monday afternoon if you fell behind. But I think it would be a really good discipline for this period if you are able to try and, at a certain point of time, I would say whatever's best for you, whether it's first thing in the morning or last thing at night, but it's generally easier to build up a habit if it happens at the same time of day. But yeah, if we can read it together, a chapter a day, I think that would be a really, really lovely thing and a good spiritual discipline for Advent in preparation for Christmas. So thank you, and I hope to see you again soon.